Good afternoon and welcome. We're happy to have each of you join us today as we discuss our latest journal article, published in the Bilingual Research Journal, highlighting the effectiveness of GOLD with bilingual children. I'm Jenny Mosley, Vice President of Research and Partnerships here at Teaching Strategies, and I'm joined today by Dr. Richard Lambert, the lead author of the article. We would like to start off by thanking you for your commitment to young children and for your interest in supporting the unique needs of bilingual learners in your programs. Before we begin our presentation, now's a good time to review some of the technical aspects of today's presentation. Please check the audio setting on your computer as well as your speaker volume setting if you're having any audio trouble. If you're still having issues, please refer to the FAQs tab above the slides window in the webcast player for assistance. There are also some other tabs that you'll find in your webcast player above the slides that offer additional information. Here you'll find my and Rich's bios, as well as a description of today's presentation. We've set aside some time at the end of today's call to answer as many questions as we can. To submit a question during the webcast, please type them in the Ask a Question box, located on the bottom left-hand side of the webcast player. Finally, an on-demand archive of today's presentation will be available online, for which you will receive an email with a link and instructions on how to access the archive once it's available. Now let's get started. So, GOLD is used to assess over 2 million children from birth through kindergarten each year, including all 50 states, territories, and is also used by the military. The demographic makeup of the classroom is ever-changing, with more DLLs in the classroom than ever before. This change prompted Dr. Lambert and his colleagues to explore the impact of GOLD on dual language learners. Exploring if the new challenges presented to teachers impacted the quality of care all children in the classroom receive. Given the nature of GOLD and it being language agnostic, it provides a great opportunity to measure the impacts of a research-based whole child assessment like GOLD with dual language learners. Prior studies have generally indicated lower performance for dual language learners relative to non-dual language learners. Programs have faced challenges to provide high-quality care and educational experiences for the children that they serve, including dual language learners. There are increasing numbers of young children who are not yet proficient in both English and their home languages, dual language learners or dual language learners. We have seen rapid changes in demographic composition of children enrolled in early education programs. As I mentioned before, GOLD is a research-based whole child formative assessment for children birth through kindergarten. The 38 objectives for development and learning highlight all of a child's skills, knowledge, and behaviors across 9 areas of development and learning. 2 objectives in GOLD address English language acquisition, that is, children's receptive and expressive skills in English. Objectives 37 and 38 enable teachers to assess on a child's ability to speak both their home language and English proficiently, or indicate where the child is along the progression for learning in English. The color-coded bands represent each age or class grade from birth through kindergarten. This allows the teacher to use one progression to accurately assess each of the children in her class, regardless if the child is emerging, meeting, or exceeding the expectations for their age group. The color bands also allow teachers to show the growth of all children in her class over the course of the year. GOLD provides a home language survey to help teachers understand a child's proficiency in English. A home language survey helps teachers identify which children in Preschool 3, Pre-K 4, and kindergarten classes are considered English language learners and should therefore be assessed using objectives 37 and 38. Language and literacy objectives in both Spanish and English make it possible to determine Spanish and English-speaking dual language learners. Knowledge, skills, and behaviors related to those objectives in both English and Spanish. For example, can a child follow directions when they're given in English? Can a child follow directions when they're given in Spanish? For all objectives other than those for language and literacy, it is ideal to assess the child's knowledge, skills, and behaviors as they demonstrate what they know and can do in their preferred language. For example, a child's ability to count to 10 in their home language or in English. So a little more about the home language survey. The answers to the survey questions help teachers determine whether or not to assess the child using the English language acquisition objectives, objectives 37 and 38. The teacher has an opportunity to complete this survey for a child when he or she first adds the child to a class in GOLD. If it's not completed at that time, the teacher can complete it when adding documentation or entering a checkpoint rating. The home language survey needs to be completed before the first checkpoint. When it's completed in a timely manner, the teacher is able to add observation notes for objectives 37 and 38. Without a completed home language survey, it's not possible to add these notes. This is important for administrators to know. Checkpoint evaluations cannot be completed until the home language survey has been completed. Teachers can download a printable version of the home language survey from Gold. If the survey responses indicate that it's appropriate to assess the child using 37 and 38, they will appear for that child throughout Gold. So there are 4 questions within the home language survey, and they should be completed collaboratively with families. Questions are rated on a scale of 1 to 5. Objectives 37 and 38 apply if the value on that 1 to 5 scale is a 2 or greater, and the child is in a preschool 3, pre-K 4, or pre-kindergarten class. So some key issues. Rich, I'll turn that over to you.
Okay, so although the DLL children are linguistically, culturally, and socially diverse, researchers usually study these children in aggregate and compare them to non-DLLs. In other words, they treat them as one group, as a homogeneous group. One major source of variability is their comfort with and competence in using English and their first language in the home and in other settings. Identifying DLL subgroups is necessary to avoid overgeneralization and to better meet the diverse needs of DLLs. So, for example, in our research, we've found that it's probably better to think of DLL children as 3 particular subgroups. The first one we've labeled emergent bilinguals, and these are children that speak mostly their first language, but use some English at home and some English in the classroom. The second group we've called bilinguals, and these are children that speak English to adults in the classroom and speak both languages at home and with other children. And the third group we've called heritage language speakers, and these are children that speak only their first or their native language at home and in the classroom. So our study, the current study that we're going to talk about today, had 2 research questions. I just want to read those to you. The first research question was, do the 3 subgroups I just talked about, the 3 subgroups of DLL differ from non-DLL children across the gold standard scores at both the beginning of the academic year and in terms of their monthly growth rates? And secondly, do classrooms differ with respect to their mean initial status and growth rates across gold standard scores based on the classroom concentration of DLLs? And we used 3 levels: classrooms that had no dual language learning children, classrooms that had 1 to 50% of the classroom, and classrooms that had the majority of the children or greater than 50% were DLL children. Now, as with any study, it's important to understand the sample that was used and to look at whether the sample accurately reflects the population that you're trying to learn more about. In this study, there were more than 300,000 children from over 21,000 classrooms from all across the United States. These children had more than 800,000 developmental progression records or placements made by their teachers, and those were, of course, at the checkpoint records, fall, winter, and spring. Roughly 18% of the children were dual language learning children, and those children broke out as follows. Approximately 7% were in our bilingual group, approximately another 7% were in the emergent bilingual group, and the remaining 4% were heritage language users. So as a part of our analyses, we looked at 5 of the 6 areas of development and learning that are available within GOLD. We used the social, emotional, language, cognitive, literacy, and math standard scores. We did not use physical because, as you can imagine, physical development is somewhat independent of language and culturation. Now, additionally, the home language survey was completed by all the teachers that had DLL population in their classrooms, so roughly 18% of the children in this study, and the results from the home language survey were used to categorize the children into one of the 3 groups that we talked about: bilingual, emergent bilingual, or heritage language speakers. Now, as far as the statistical methods for this study, we used what's called 3-level growth curve modeling, and this approach allows us to examine both the level of children's development at the beginning of the year and the growth of children as shown by the GOLD scale scores. It also allows us to examine which child and classroom characteristics are related to the starting scores and are related to the growth that the children are making across the year. We were also able to use several of the child demographic factors and classroom characteristics as control variables to allow for a much more robust set of findings. For example, we were able to control for child ethnicity and child disability status. Now let's look next at some of our key findings. In terms of initial status, or where the children started at the beginning of the year, there were several interesting results that emerged. For the scale scores at the beginning of the year, all three DLL groups were generally rated lower than all other children in the classroom. All three DLL groups were rated lower than non-DLLs in the areas of language, cognitive, and mathematics. However, there were some interesting differences between the DLL groups. For example, bilingual children were not different from non-DLL children in the areas of literacy and social emotional. For all domains of development, heritage language speakers showed the largest gaps between themselves and the non-DLL children, followed by emergent bilinguals. Bilingual children had the smallest differences with non-DLL children across all domains of development. Now, in terms of the growth rates, let's review some of the findings there. DLL children grew faster than non-DLL children throughout the year. This finding illustrates the benefits of pre-kindergarten education for children. However, for emergent bilinguals and for heritage language speakers, these higher growth rates were not enough to overcome the initial differences they showed relative to non-DLL children. The table that you see on the screen summarizes a lot of the findings of this study and speaks specifically to the comparisons between each of the three groups and the non-DLL children. I just want to highlight a couple of the findings from the study as we look at this slide. So, for example, for the difference between bilingual children and non-DLLs, the bilingual children had a growth rate advantage, and at the end of the year, they were equivalent to non-DLLs in cognitive and math areas, and they actually scored higher on average in literacy and social emotional areas. If we look at the growth rate findings for emergent bilinguals, their growth rates were too small to make up for the initial differences between themselves and the non-DLL children, except in the area of social emotional. In that area, they grew faster than non-DLL children and did essentially catch up by the end of the year. In terms of the heritage language speakers, they had the fastest growth rate in the area of cognitive, mathematics, and social emotional. Other research has demonstrated that children that start out lower than other children often do make higher gains across the year, particularly for DLL children. So let's go on to summarize the classroom level analyses, because we not only analyzed the growth that children make during the year and the effects of some of their, or the impact that some of their demographics had, but we also looked at classroom level analysis. We included the classroom concentration levels of DLL children in the models. For initial scores, classrooms with DLL children had higher scores across all domains of development. This finding illustrates the value of a diverse classroom and the additional cognitive stimulation that may be associated with the use of multiple languages in the same classroom. However, in classrooms with high concentrations of DLL children, that is, the majority of the children were DLL, or over 50%, the average social emotional scores were lower than classrooms with no DLL children. This finding illustrates the relationship between language skills and social functioning for young children. However, classrooms with high concentrations, greater than 50% of DLL children, did have faster average growth rates than classrooms with no DLL children across all areas of development except literacy. The next slide highlights some of the classroom findings. We classified classrooms, as we mentioned before, into three groups according to the DLL concentration levels. Those classrooms that had no DLL children, classrooms with 1 to 50% DLL children, and classrooms where the majority of the children were DLL children. This table shows how the study broke out these three groups. So we can see that in classrooms that had no DLL children versus classrooms that had some but not the majority, there was a slower growth rate in literacy only but no difference in the other areas. When we contrasted classrooms with the majority DLL children versus classrooms with no DLL children, these classrooms had faster growth rates in all areas except literacy. So this study has some important implications for both classroom practice and for teacher training. First, teacher education and in-service training may need to be made available that considers the differentiation of instruction needed to focus on the gaps between DLL and non-DLL children. Second, teacher-child language and ethnicity match may be an important factor in the classroom when there's high concentrations of DLL children. And finally, bilingual teachers may be more sensitive to children's literacy abilities and appropriate social behaviors based on both school and home expectations. A few more implications to talk about. It is important for teachers to understand how they can maximize growth in the children in their classroom. This study suggests that small group composition and instructional differentiation can be a benefit for a more complete understanding for where each child is in the process of dual language learning and dual language acquisition. In addition, it is important for teachers to recognize that DLL children may experience fewer meaningful math-specific instruction and interactions prior to the preschool experience. So in conclusion, we want to point out a couple of the more important implications from the study. This study illustrates that gold scale scores are sensitive to differences between subgroups of young children based on their dual language learning status. It also illustrates how gold scale scores can be very useful to track growth over time for both native English-speaking children and for DLL children. Finally, this study illustrates how the home language survey items can really help teachers understand that dual language learning children are not a single group, and they should not be instructed in the same ways. These items can be very helpful to teachers as they begin to learn about the children and families they serve and how they can plan to use the most effective instructional strategies for all children. So remember, we found that in summary, that DLL children are not a single group, and if teachers begin to use the home language survey in combination with, when appropriate, the particular progressions that Jenny talked about earlier, they can get a more nuanced understanding of who the children are in their class and perhaps use our three-group classification system as a way of thinking about what some of the different needs are for the subgroups of children and how they can support their growth and learning. So we have some questions that are coming in. Maybe we'll start to look at some of those. So we have, let's see, one of our listeners, Florence, says, to meet the more stringent Head Start standards, what recommendations can be given that would help educators with the home language maintenance piece, especially if they are not speakers of other languages? Wow, that's a great question.
Well, I definitely feel that it's important at the beginning of the year that the home language survey be a ritual or be part of the routine of how teachers prepare their children's portfolios at the beginning of the year. So it should be an automatic step. So the first question a teacher should ask themselves about each child in their class is this child a native English speaker? If the child is not a native English speaker, then the home language survey should automatically be part of the routine of working with the family to understand if the child, has a 2 or greater, as we mentioned, meaning are they proficient in receptive and expressive English? And if they are not, then making sure that those objectives 37 and 38 are turned on for that child so that they can be tracked and monitored over the course of the year.
We have another really interesting question. What is the key difference between bilinguals and emergent bilinguals? This comes from Shannon. Very good question. Probably all of us have seen children in classrooms that can very quickly change between their native language and English, and can even maybe at times translate for children that are at a much earlier stage of acculturation and language acquisition. So the bilingual children are the children that can truly switch between both languages and maybe even speak to children in the classroom in both their native language and in English, and also can use English with adults. The emergent bilinguals are really the children who are just starting to do that. So it is pretty clear, I think, in the classroom environment which is which. And the key issue, I think the most important issue to see with the bilingual children is they try to interact with English-speaking children in English and other children that speak their native language in their native language, and maybe even try to help those children understand what's going on in the classroom.
Are there other questions that people have?
If we can just touch briefly on the previous question about maintaining the home language. Of course, it's always important to continue to stay well connected with the family and help the family understand how they can continue to stimulate the child in both languages if that's possible. Let's see, we have a new question from Michelle.
So she's asking about objectives 37 and 38, and it was her belief that the teacher needed to be a Spanish speaker in order to assess on those skills, and that's not the case. It's assessing if the child can speak English fluently, expressive and receptive skills. So it's assessing any child whose primary language is other than English. They do not need to be, the teacher does not need to be a native Spanish speaker or whatever other language the child might speak in order to assess on 37 and 38. So while observing using 37 and 38, should teachers be assessing student language acquisition in Spanish? If the child's primary language is Spanish and the teacher has the ability to assess in Spanish, that's wonderful. We do have Spanish language and literacy items, and those can certainly be utilized. If the teacher's home language is not in Spanish, then they would only be assessing the child's English abilities for the English language and literacy items. It is important to remember that the other areas of development and learning, social, emotional, physical, cognition, and math, are language agnostic. So if the child is performing those skills or is able to enter a group successfully, the language does not matter, and those skills should be rated accordingly. So we have another question. Will speaking both languages, do you think it is harder for children? So I'm thinking that this question is, if the teacher is speaking both languages, do you feel that will be harder for the children? I don't, especially if they are truly bilingual, or if they're emerging bilingual. It will likely help the child feel more comfortable in showing their skills, knowledge, and behaviors in the classroom. Rich, do you have anything to add to that?
No, that's certainly research supports the use of as much cognitive stimulation as we can for children, and that can include multiple languages.
Okay.
We have a good comment from Jan from the National Center on Early Childhood Development, Teaching, and Learning. She says, maintaining the home language, relative to maintaining the home language, there are resources under the Planned Language Approach on the Office of Head Start Early Childhood Learning and Knowledge Center that address this issue. Very helpful.
And we love Jan. Good to hear from you, Jan.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jan.
We've had some other questions in general about, why some of these subgroups seem to be scoring on gold lower than native English speakers. Remember that gold is not a direct assessment, so it's really not related to whether we're using the English or Spanish, for example, items in gold. It's really about the evidences that teachers are collecting and what they're seeing in the classroom. What often happens, particularly in social emotional, is children that are early in the language acquisition process and early in the acculturation process may be very silent, may be withholding interaction from other children. And so we're really focusing on what the teacher is seeing in the classroom. May not completely represent how the child is behaving or performing, so to speak, in other settings.
So we have a question: how would a teacher assess counting, for example, if they do not speak the child's home language? Oftentimes when we're working in small groups or if a child is in the block area, we can ask, to put together 10 blocks or to use certain manipulatives to show that they have those skills outside of having to be verbal about it. They can actually show that those skills in that way. It's also important to remember, if you have anyone in your community, if the family or if there are other community members in the school maybe that do speak the child's primary language, it would be great to have them involved to help support the child's documentation and their abilities.
We've had several questions about things like reliability and validity of assessment, or how can a child be assessed when their language is something other than the teacher speaks, etc. A lot of this comes back to remembering the purpose of gold and the way gold was developed and validated. It is not a direct assessment, right? So there's nothing that we're directly doing to children. We're looking at the evidences they're producing in the classroom in the course of regular instruction. But again, as Jenny pointed out, it's going to be very helpful to have another source of evidences on the children from a teacher or co-teacher or parent that does speak the native language so that you can get the full range of evidences that you're producing in the normal course of instruction. But it's not about directly assessing children in their native language. It's about observing what they're doing in the classroom. Very good point. Cynthia points out some of the progressions do use language like verbally counts. So I'm not suggesting you don't have to understand what the child is saying. It's a great point. For a child whose native language is not English, this comes from Angela, is the language area of gold based on their communication in their home language or English? Great question.
It's based on their English. So the tool is only available in Spanish and in English at the moment. So if the child's primary language is Spanish, then you are to use their Spanish language and literacy items. Otherwise, the literacy and language are for English measurement. So we're slowly getting in a couple of more questions that we've already addressed, it seems, in previous questions. We'll give a few more minutes to see if there are any additional questions.
So we have an interesting comment this is from Lizette. It says, oftentimes dual language learners in our program appear to observe and take in everything around them. After the first year within the program, we find DLLs begin to interact and speak the English language, especially when the teachers do not speak in the child's home language. So, of course, we know teaching young children is an exciting time to see a lot of growth and development, but you're particularly going to see a lot of growth and development, social and cognitive, for children who are dual language learners. It is exciting to see that, and to see the child emerge into someone who can interact more completely with the rest of the classroom. And that's not just language acquisition, right? That's acculturation and becoming familiar with the rules of the classroom, etc.
Okay, well, it seems that we have finished off our questions piece or portion. If you have additional questions, please feel free to reach out to us. We're always available to discuss the article or anything around GOLD or Objectives 37 and 38, the home language survey, that you have questions about. We appreciate you joining us today, and we hope that this was informational, and we hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you.